There's a country that's the world's sixth largest by land area, covering 7.69 million square kilometers, about two-thirds the size of China. Yet it has a population of only 27 million, barely more than Beijing, and it's unbelievably rich in natural resources. It's the world's largest exporter of iron, ore, coal, and wool, and holds 35% of the world's bauxite reserves. Even so, manufacturing accounts for less than 6% of its GDP, and its industrial output is smaller than Vietnam's. There's a country north of us that's pretty similar on paper, yet it's dirt poor. But this one down south is incredibly wealthy. Its GDP per capita exceeds $60,000, more than 5 times China's. A street cleaner in Australia can earn the equivalent of 200,000 to 300,000 yuan a year, while miners can make over $1 million. They only need a few days' wages to buy an RTX 5090. So how does that make any sense? No manufacturing, just living off natural resources. So where does all that money actually come from? Don't just say, they've got mines. Sure, having resources helps. That's common sense. But sometimes common sense is wrong. Take Russia. It's twice the size of Australia, has 6 times the population, and is loaded with oil, natural gas, coal, and iron ore. It's basically an all-around resource powerhouse. Colonial wealth, an early start in industrialization, vast land, a sparse population, abundant resources. Russia checks every box that supposedly leads to becoming a developed country. Yet its GDP per capita is less than 1/3 of Australia's. Life for ordinary people isn't exactly easy, and one of the quickest ways to make money is risking your life on the Russia-Ukraine battlefield. Then there's Mongolia. It has plenty of copper, gold, and coal beneath its grasslands, yet its GDP per capita is only a little over $4,000, even lower than some African countries. So what does that tell us? Simply having resources isn't enough. Minerals are just raw materials, and there's still a huge gap between raw materials and real prosperity. So what exactly did Australia get right? Let's start with its mines. Australia's mineral deposits aren't just abundant, they're exceptionally high quality. Iron ore is the best example. In the Pilbara region of Western Australia, iron ore is exposed right at the surface, with ore grades exceeding 62%. Some mines produce, or that's practically ready to ship with almost no processing, and they're unbelievably close to major ports. The trains run straight to Port Headland. It's loaded onto ships and sails directly to China. China imports about $70 billion worth of Australian iron ore every year, spread across Australia's population. That's more than $3,400 per person annually from iron ore alone. Transportation costs are the key. Brazil's Vale produces iron ore that's just as good, but shipping it from Brazil to China means sailing halfway around the globe, driving freight costs up several times over. That's why, even when Australia creates political tensions, China still has to keep buying its iron ore. There simply isn't a more cost-effective alternative. And it's not just iron. Australia's coal, natural gas, lithium, bauxite, and gold are all world-class commodities. In 2023, Australia's exports averaged $14,000 per person, driven almost entirely by minerals and agricultural products. During the same period, Japan exported about $6,000 per person, while South Korea reached $12,200. Australia's export mix couldn't be simpler: iron ore, coal, and agricultural products. Yet its exports per capita outperform those of these industrial powerhouses. But that's only part of the story. Why is Australia's export structure so simple? What many people don't realize is that Australia used to be a manufacturing powerhouse. Back in the 1960s, manufacturing made up nearly 30% of its GDP. It was the country's largest economic sector and employed more than a quarter of the workforce. It had everything: cars, machinery, chemicals. Australia was a genuine industrialized nation. The turning point came in the 1970s, when container shipping spread worldwide. Shipping costs collapsed, making global relocation of manufacturing possible. If production costs were high, no problem. Move the factory somewhere cheaper, then ship the finished goods back. It could still cost less than making them locally. Australia's manufacturing sector was one of the first casualties of this trend because the country simply wasn't well suited for large-scale industry. First, water. Look at a global water resources map, and you'll see that most of Australia is marked in yellow or brown: water shortages or severe water shortages. Only the southeast, around Melbourne and Tasmania, has relatively abundant fresh water. That meant industry had to be squeezed into that small region. Steel mills, chemical plants, textile factories, they're all massive water consumers. Those limited water resources simply couldn't support large-scale industry. Then there's geography. The sea route from Sydney to Jakarta is about 6,000 kilometers, and it's over 8,000 kilometers to Shanghai. It's surrounded by ocean and far from the world's busiest shipping lanes. Once shipping costs fell, East Asian countries gained a huge advantage. They imported raw materials from Australia, processed them, and sold finished products worldwide. Australia, meanwhile, became little more than a supplier of raw materials and a consumer market. So Australia's industrial decline was actually a rational economic choice. Once it realized manufacturing costs were far higher than its competitors, it made more sense to switch to a different strategy than keep fighting a losing battle. Since the 1970s, Australia's manufacturing sector has continued to shrink, and today it accounts for less than 6% of GDP. So if the country no longer relies on manufacturing and mainly sells minerals, how does that wealth turn into high salaries for ordinary people? To answer that, we need to talk about some basic economics. A lot of people think mining doesn't require much skill and can't compare to making chips or building cars. But economics follows objective reality, not people's gut feelings. Mining is all about selling something scarce. There are only a handful of truly world-class mines on Earth. Nature spent billions of years creating those deposits. That's true scarcity. Scarcity gives you pricing power, and pricing power brings profits. The world's 4 mining giants, Rio Tinto, BHP, Fortescue, and Vale, posted average net profit margins of roughly 11.5% to 18.6% in 2024. Meanwhile, China's steel industry had a profit margin of less than 0.4%, nearly 50 times lower. You work your way from iron ore to steel, then roll it into sheet metal and stamp it into auto parts. Then you assemble the finished vehicle. Hundreds of thousands of people across the supply chain do the work, but most of the profits end up with the miners upstream. The EV industry is locked in a brutal price war. The people really making easy money are the ones sitting on lithium mines. But when it comes to national strategy and employment, profits aren't the most important thing. What's more important is creating jobs and supporting entire industrial supply chains. That's not today's focus, though, so we won't go into it. Take semiconductors. Samsung's chip business is the largest in the world. Yet in the first quarter of 2023, weak market conditions pushed it into the red. But when have you ever seen Mutai or Pian Zhuang operating at a loss? The natural resources business works a lot like Mutai. I've got the product, you don't. Buy it or don't. Manufacturing is a brutal meat grinder. It's a global battlefield where everyone fights to the death over price. Why is East Asia so fiercely competitive? Because it's doing the toughest, most exhausting, and least profitable work in the supply chain. Among major automakers, only Toyota consistently maintains profit margins around 10%. Honda, Nissan, Hyundai, Chery, and Geely often make less than 5%. Some years they even lose money. Thin profits simply can't support high wages. So the whole economy ends up trapped in relentless competition. Australia's advantage is that it sidestepped that trap. Instead of competing to build the cheapest cars, it sells everyone the raw materials needed to make them. No matter how strong East Asia's manufacturing becomes, it still has to buy minerals from Australia. The harder you compete, the more raw materials you need, and the more money Australia makes. From a profit standpoint, this approach really does work for smaller countries with modest populations and fewer ambitions. But saying Australia got rich purely because nature blessed, it would be selling those Anglo colonists short. The Australian continent was never naturally well suited for human settlement, let alone agriculture. A few details will make that clear. Let's start with the soil. Australia sits on the world's oldest and most stable continental crust. No volcanic eruptions, no glaciers, and no major tectonic uplift. It lacks all 3 natural processes that replenish soil nutrients. Look at a global map of soil organic carbon, and Australia is almost entirely pale. Its soils are extremely low in organic matter, astonishingly infertile. They're deficient in phosphorus and nitrogen, and generally acidic. Before the 1840s, settlers had little idea how to farm there. Most of their food had to be shipped from Britain. Drop a bunch of ordinary farmers there, and they'd probably starve. Then there's the climate. The interior is hot, dry, and receives very little rainfall, with huge year-to-year fluctuations. When drought hits, wheat production can plummet. Locals joke that it's the kind of weather where even the dogs don't want to go outside. Later, Australians realized that while the dry climate had its downsides, it was actually ideal for growing high-protein wheat, producing hard wheat with exceptional gluten strength. That's the premium ingredient for high-quality bread. Australian wheat is consistent in quality and yields a high amount of flour. Its flour is bright white, low in pesticide residues, and commands premium prices on the global grain market. The livestock industry followed a similar path. Australia's natural grasslands have very low carrying capacity, supporting only 0.2 to 0.5 sheep per hectare. That's because the continent historically had no large grazing animals. Its native grasses never co-evolved with herbivores. On the African savanna, grasses boost their protein content during the rainy season, making themselves more appealing to grazers. That's because grazing animals help spread their seeds. Australian grasses never developed that strategy. They're high in silica, coarse, and low in protein, so cattle and sheep don't like eating them. So what did they do? Simple, they imported better species. Australia brought in alfalfa, white clover, and ryegrass from Europe to improve its pastures. Alfalfa is a deep-rooted legume that fixes nitrogen, resists drought, and is rich in protein. White clover stays green through winter, while ryegrass is cold-tolerant. Together, they perfectly filled the autumn and winter feed gap. After the improvements, stocking density increased from 0.2 sheep per hectare to 2 to 8 sheep, a more than tenfold increase. Here's another interesting story. Australia's native dung beetles had spent thousands of years dealing only with the dry, pellet-like droppings of kangaroos and platypuses. They had no interest in the soft, wet manure produced by cattle and sheep. As a result, manure piled up across the pastures for years without breaking down. The grass was smothered, and flies swarmed everywhere. In 1965, Australia launched the Australian Dung Beetle Project. Scientists searched the world for dung beetles that could process soft manure. In 1967, they found the perfect species in China. These beetles roll manure into balls, lay their eggs inside, and bury them deep underground. A pair of dung beetles can process 100 grams of cow manure in just 30 to 40 hours. Fly eggs, meanwhile, need more than 90 hours to hatch. The flies get buried alive before they even hatch. Over the following decades, Chinese dung beetles transformed Australia's livestock ecosystem. There were fewer flies, the soil became more fertile, and the pastures grew better. China doesn't raise useless bugs. Even its exported insects can make a real contribution. So Australia makes money from mining, and its agriculture is doing pretty well too. But the real question remains, how does all that money turn into annual salaries of 200,000 to 300,000 yuan for ordinary workers? The answer lies in exchange rates. Imagine two workers. One in China earns 5,000 yuan a month, while one in Australia earns 5,000 Australian dollars. A car wash costs about 30 bucks, a haircut 50, and eating out averages around 80 per person. At that level, their purchasing power is basically the same. The price of labor-intensive services is largely determined by wages. The real difference shows up in manufactured goods. A 60-inch TV made in China sells for 499 Australian dollars in Australia. That Australian worker could buy 10 of them with 1 month's pay. The same TV costs 2,300 yuan in China, which is about half a month's salary. A pair of Nike shoes made in Vietnam costs 79 Australian dollars, so an Australian can buy 2 pairs with a day's wages. In China, they cost around 370 yuan, which means tightening your belt. An iPhone costs 999 Australian dollars in Australia, so 1 month's salary can buy 5 of them. In China, it costs about 5,000 yuan, and a month's pay still isn't enough to buy one. So where does Australians' higher standard of living come from? Exchange rates. They earn developed country wages while buying manufactured goods produced with developing country labor costs. That price gap is globalization's bonus for Australia. But here's the question. If Australia only bought goods and never sold anything, the Australian dollar should eventually lose value. It keeps spending Australian dollars on Chinese TVs, Vietnamese shoes, and Indian smartphones, sending its currency overseas. As the currency becomes less scarce, its value and purchasing power would collapse. So what keeps the Australian dollar strong? Exports. Australia sells iron, ore, coal, natural gas, wheat, and wool, bringing foreign currency back into the country. And because its resources are exceptionally high quality and scarce, it has strong pricing power. Prices are set by the global market, not by local production costs. That creates a perfect cycle. Sell resources, earn foreign currency, and maintain a strong exchange rate. Then use that strong currency to buy inexpensive manufactured goods from around the world, letting ordinary people live comfortably. That's how wealth gets redistributed under globalization. To a large extent, the inexpensive goods produced by Chinese workers working 996 schedules help support the purchasing power of developed countries. Australia is one of the biggest beneficiaries of that system, because it controls a critical link in the supply chain, natural resources, and no one can easily replace it. That said, this doesn't mean China hasn't benefited. In fact, China is one of the biggest winners under this model. But today's focus is Australia, so we'll leave it at that. Still, that's not the whole story. Australia's service sector accounts for 78% of its GDP. Insurance, finance, education, media, and consulting all benefit from English being the world's common language. Sydney is one of the Asia-Pacific's major financial hubs. The big four banks dominate the domestic market and earn enormous profits. Its education industry attracts hundreds of thousands of international students every year. Chinese students make up a significant share of them. There's a joke that perfectly sums up Australia's economy. Sydney sells financial services, Melbourne sells degrees, Adelaide sells wine, Brisbane sells tourism, and Perth sells rocks. Every one of those industries generates a steady stream of cash. Then there's Australia's financial system. The mining sector generates real cash flow based on global commodity prices. The banking sector amplifies, recycles, and puts that money to work. Real estate and the pension system keep feeding capital into the financial system. Mining and banking together account for about 60% of the Australian stock market. Once this system gets going, it's like a reliable money printing machine. Natural resources are the engine, and finance is the transmission. The English language advantage is the lubricant. Together, those three factors have created Australia's standard of living. At this point, some people might still question this model. Why can't other resource-rich countries copy it? The answer is simple. The requirements are incredibly demanding. Russia is also a major resource exporter, but it has 6 times Australia's population. That dramatically reduces the amount of resources available per person. Even worse, much of the resource wealth never reaches ordinary people. Oligarchs, corruption, international sanctions, and the cost of war all drain the country's wealth. Saudi Arabia and the UAE became wealthy by exporting oil, but their economies are extremely dependent on a single industry, so when oil prices fall, the whole country feels it. Religious and cultural barriers also make it harder to build diverse service industries. On top of that, they rely heavily on foreign labor. Citizens make up only a small share of the population, so the wealth is concentrated among relatively few people. Argentina and Brazil pursued import substitution policies during the last century. They poured resources into factories and manufacturing, hoping to copy the industrialization path of developed countries. But their manufactured goods couldn't compete on the international market. They survived only behind high tariff barriers. When debt crises hit, that protectionist model collapsed. factories shut down, economic growth stalled, and they fell into the middle-income trap. Those countries ignored their comparative advantages in agriculture and mining. They insisted on tackling the much tougher manufacturing sector and ended up losing on both fronts. Australia's advantage is that it has every key ingredient: world-class natural resources, an extremely low population density, strong institutions inherited from the British system, and a stable political environment. It's also geographically far from major geopolitical conflicts. All of those advantages combined created the Australia we see today. Take away any one of them, and the whole story falls apart. There's actually another country that's quite similar: Norway. It built its wealth on North Sea oil and gas, while also developing high-end services and luxury industries. With a small population, it's thrived in the Western world. Maybe we'll cover Norway another time. So only countries like Australia and Norway, with all these conditions in place, can stay wealthy without relying heavily on manufacturing. But replace those 27 million people with 1.4 billion. And Australia's model wouldn't last a single day. It's simply a matter of math. After all, 7.7 million square kilometers shared by just 27 million people means everyone gets a much larger slice. In the end, Australia's prosperity is really a story about arithmetic. A huge numerator and a tiny denominator naturally produce an impressive result.